Under the full moon's glow, Prince Duke sits reading a book when he senses a presence nearby. Without looking up, he addresses her, Mel. Surprised that he noticed her, Mel steps forward, admitting there was no point in trying to hide once the prince had already discovered her. He simply asks how things went. Mel reports that she successfully delivered his message to the intended person, and then asks if it will make a difference. The prince, closing his book, responds that he doesn't know. The scene shifts to Alice, who is investigating the village of Loana. She recalls the king's words about the village struggling even to afford bread, though curiously, that detail no longer appears in the kingdom's records. Alice muses that a true villain wouldn't rely on secondhand information, so she decides to investigate the village in person. Knowing she wouldn't be allowed to leave easily, she devises a clever plan. She'll go in disguise. Determined, Alice sets off on her journey. Though the sounds of the forest unsettle her, she steels herself, reminding herself that she is a villain and mustn't be afraid of mere noises. As Alice approaches Loana, she remembers that a magical barrier surrounds the village, designed to keep criminals from escaping. She isn't certain her own magic will allow her to cross it. Upon entering the village, she's overwhelmed by the foul stench and the terrible living conditions. She even notices people sleeping in the streets, homeless. Alice realizes that if the villagers discovered she was a noble, they might turn on her. Just as this thought crosses her mind, a man taps her on the shoulder, immediately putting her on edge. The man asks her to put away her sword, explaining that it could cause unnecessary trouble since she is clearly not from around there. After confirming she's a stranger, he asks her to follow him. The man leads Alice to a small house, where he introduces himself as Will. Without hesitation, Will addresses her as noble, surprising Alice. He hadn't mentioned it before. She starts to apologize, but Will isn't concerned. He explains that even though he is blind, he can perceive many things through sound. For example, he could tell from the way her footsteps fell unevenly that she was carrying a sword, and from the rustle of her clothing, he knew she was a woman. Her scent, clean and fresh compared to the villagers, told him she was from outside the village. Will then deduces that if she came from outside, she must be an aristocrat with magic. He adds that, in his sighted days, he was surrounded by people like her, so her presence doesn't surprise him. Will reveals that he once worked at the castle, but was exiled to Loana after offending a superior, which cost him his sight. He continues, speaking about how traditions shouldn't constrain the present and how history should be studied to improve the current world. However, he points out, learning from books means nothing if it isn't applied in real life. Alice, moved by Will's wisdom, can't believe such a remarkable man was exiled. She asks if he holds any hatred toward the nobility. Will admits that he would be lying if he said he didn't, but he remains hopeful that one day someone will understand his actions. Shifting the focus back to Alice, Will asks her what she's doing in such a dangerous place. Alice opens up to him, sharing everything, including her dream of becoming a villain. Will listens intently, never judging her, treating her with respect throughout their conversation. Afterward, Alice bids farewell to Will, promising to return, but Will urges her not to. It's too dangerous. Yet Alice isn't deterred. She feels it would be a waste to leave things as they are, believing that men like Will are hard to find. A year passes after this encounter. Alice notes that over the past 2 years, she has spent her time reading constantly, learning swordsmanship, and visiting Will often. But now, things are about to change. Her brother Albert's birthday is approaching, and he will soon enter the Magic Academy, the setting of the events from the game Alice knows. She's also aware that Duke and the heroine have likely met by now, and might even be drawn to each other. With that in mind, Alice feels an urgent desire to embrace her role as the villain and face them head-on. Eric suddenly appears, inviting Alicia to join him for a trip to the city. However, his brother Henry quickly intervenes, insisting that they can't go alone. Eric then asks about their other brother, Alan, but Henry informs him that Alan is busy studying. So, it's decided that the three of them, Eric, Henry, and Alicia, will head to the city together. Their first stop is a shop owned by one of Eric's friends. The shopkeeper introduces himself to Alicia as Paul, the plant seller. Paul shares that his family specializes in green magic, and that he is a noble, though of a lower rank. He enthusiastically talks about the wonders of plants, explaining how they can cure illnesses and heal the soul. Paul grew up surrounded by plants, which made it easy for him to study them, and his goal is to use his knowledge to help others. During their conversation, Alicia briefly explains the uses of amaranth, which catches Paul off guard. He's impressed and asks if she's particularly fond of plants. Alicia, trying to maintain her villainous facade, dismisses his compliment, saying that her knowledge is something everyone should know and that those who don't must not have studied enough. Paul is taken aback by her response, realizing that he just sounded like a proper villain, as Alicia would never openly admit to reading so many books. He mentally notes that he should keep studying how a true villain behaves. Paul, shifting the tone, jokes with Eric, teasing him that if he's not careful, he might find himself with many rivals for Alicia's attention. This comment makes Henry a bit jealous, and he quickly declares that he won't allow anyone to date his sister. Back at the castle, Albert asks Alicia about their day out. Alicia responds that she had fun, while Duke watches Eric closely, aware that he spent time with Alicia. Meanwhile, Curtis playfully asks Alicia to go out with him next time and inquires if there's anywhere she'd like to visit or something she'd like to do. Alicia tells him she'd like to take a fencing test to gauge how much she has improved, expressing her frustration that her father and brothers keep discouraging her from the idea. Albert reminds her that she's only 10 years old and, on top of that, a girl. Alicia counters by pointing out that both he and their other two brothers had taken the fencing test when they were her age. Albert, however, firmly refuses, telling her that no means no, which leaves Alicia seething with anger. When he tries to approach her, she pushes him away, declaring that she won't give up before storming off. Inside, Alicia feels pleased with herself, knowing that her behavior just now was perfectly villainous. Determined, Alicia steels herself to confront her father and brother, who continue to argue about not letting her take the test. When she finally reaches them, her father convinces her to wait until she turns 15 to bring up the subject again. Reluctantly, Alicia agrees and leaves, though clearly dissatisfied. Once she's gone, Albert speaks privately with their father, and it becomes clear why they're so hesitant. They both know that Alicia is a better swordsman than any boy her age. Allowing her to take the exam would likely draw significant attention, for better or worse. Albert shares a curious concern with his father. It's very likely that the 5 great families are already aware of what's happening, and he's unsure how much longer they can keep things hidden. Still, he hopes that as long as Alicia remains a child, she can lead a normal life. In her room, Alice grows frustrated with being treated like a child. Although she is only 10 years old, she tells herself that she cannot afford to waste any more time. Her goal is to become the greatest villain in history, so she decides to visit Will, hoping he might help her understand what she's feeling. When Alice arrives at Lawana during the day, she sees the town's true face, as she had only visited it at night before. Violence runs rampant among the people, and even children are not spared from the brutality. Shocked, Alice almost intervenes, but Will arrives just in time to stop her, knowing that she wouldn't be able to do anything in her current state. After all, she's still a child. Later, back at the cabin, Will tends to an injured boy, though he doubts the boy will survive as he doesn't seem strong enough. Will explains that such tragedies are common in Lawana. He gathers children together to teach them how to read and do basic math, but the boy is special, an orphan but remarkably intelligent. Even at 6 years old, he would impress someone as old as Will. With proper education, Will believes the boy could become a great man. However, the town's children are viewed as lifelong criminals, and Will admits that no matter how much he despises it, there's little he can do to change that. He tells Alice not to blame herself for what happens in Lawana. Reflecting on her privileged position, Alice feels torn. She knows a villain wouldn't care about helping others, but she feels an urge to do something. Comparing herself to the heroine, who would have acted to save the children, she feels frustrated by her inability to intervene. Without hesitation, she decides to seek Paul's help. Alice asks Paul for some amaranth. Concerned, Paul inquires if someone is sick or hurt, but he doesn't press her when Alice hesitates to explain. Without asking further questions, Paul gives her the amaranth, along with instructions on how to use it. He refuses to let her pay, simply asking her to continue visiting his shop. Back in Lawana, Alice delivers the medicine to Will. Though it won't heal the boy's wounds, it will keep him alive for the time being. Will thanks her, but Alice confesses that she feels helpless. She had been so focused on becoming a villain, but none of that matters if she can't act when the time comes. From now on, she resolves to study harder and dedicate herself fully to becoming a villain who will leave her mark on history. The next day, determined, Alice begins her search for a grimoire. She believes that mastering magic is the key to becoming a formidable villain. As if by fate, a hidden section of the library appears, filled with magic books. Alice is astonished. Now she truly has the chance to achieve her goal. After studying numerous books, Alice learns that magic is divided into levels. Spells from level 50 onwards require the mana of the 5 great families, and the highest recorded magic level is 100. Alice recalls that, at some point in the game, Prince Duke and the heroine surpass that level. Even though a villain might be destined to be weaker than the heroine, Alice resolves to do her best regardless. She starts by practicing level 1 magic, which involves levitating objects. After a few attempts, she successfully levitates a small book. Encouraged, she moves on to level 5 magic, allowing her to move entire books. However, she starts to feel tired and decides to rest for 5 minutes. Just then, Alice hears her father calling her name. To her surprise, it seems the king has come to visit her. In her mind, Alice sees this as a test, a trial for a villain. During the carriage ride, the Duke asks the king why he wants to see Alice. The king explains that he hasn't heard much from her lately and wants to know what she's been up to. Once they arrive, Alice finds herself before the leaders of the 5 great families, and she wonders if her villainous reputation has already reached them. The king gets straight to the point, asking Alice what she thinks of the kingdom, specifically, how it operates. Thinking like a true villain, Alice bluntly replies that she despises the preferential treatment given to nobles, noting that the most incompetent individuals rule simply because of their noble status. Some of the leaders are visibly offended, but they allow her to continue. Alice adds that this doesn't apply to all nobles. It only takes mana to be considered powerful, but mana and political skill are entirely different. No matter how talented a commoner is, they will never be given a chance. It's absurd how much potential is wasted under this system, she says, and it gives her a headache. The king then asks one final question. If she despises the system so much, does it bother her to belong to one of the 5 great families? True to her role, Alice replies that being born into her family was purely by chance, and to cling to such status while more talented people are left behind would be vulgar. As the audience ends, Alice, visibly exhausted, begins to falter. Before she collapses, Duke rushes to catch her. Albert, who is nearby, suggests they take her to her room, but Duke insists on carrying her himself. Once in her room, Alice briefly opens her eyes. Duke, noticing this, rushes to fetch the medicine for her. When she doesn't respond in a desperate act, he takes the medicine and passes it to her through a kiss. If you've reached this point in the video, don't forget to leave the word exquisito in the comments. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.